I used to think revenge stories were exaggerated, stitched together for clicks. Then I watched my livelihood turn into ash because one person decided a scratched cat meant total war. The question that kept rattling in my head wasn't whether she crossed a line, but whether she really thought she could get away with it. This all started quietly, the way the worst HOA nightmare stories usually do, with a complaint that sounded almost reasonable on paper. It ended with sirens in the distance, smoke curling into a dawn sky, and me standing there realizing someone had tried to erase years of work overnight, the air sharp with the smell of burnt hay. I didn't scream. I didn't threaten. I didn't rush into some reckless confrontation. I documented, waited, and let the system she worshipped trap her. That patience is the only reason this turned from a tragedy into a satisfying reckoning, and it all traces back to one neighbor who couldn't accept that the world didn't revolve around her pet. The part nobody expects is how small the first spark was, and how the deadline she set for me became the fuse for her own downfall. I live on a modest working farm tucked against a planned community, the kind of place where manicured lawns stop abruptly and fields take over, cicadas buzzing loud in the afternoon heat. When I bought the property, the association assured me I was grandfathered into my operations. Livestock was permitted, fencing was compliant, and the board had even noted it in their records as an agricultural exception. For years, it was quiet coexistence. My days were predictable, measured by feed schedules and weather shifts, sunlight glinting off the barn roof at noon. Then a new board election rolled through, and with it came a woman I'll call Ms. K. She moved in from a nearby city subdivision and brought with her a rigid sense of order and a belief that rules existed to be enforced, not understood. Ms. K latched onto the association like it was a badge of authority. Within weeks, notices started appearing on neighbors' doors about grass height and mailbox alignment. Most people grumbled and complied. I stayed off her radar until the afternoon her cat wandered where it shouldn't have, the distant sound of barking carrying over the fence. The incident itself was brief and non-dramatic. My dog was secured inside the fenced area, doing what farm dogs do, and the cat slipped through a gap I'd already scheduled to repair. There was a scuffle, fur flew, and it ended with a superficial scratch. No vet emergency, no lasting harm, just a shaken animal and a furious owner. I apologized immediately and offered to cover any vet costs. I even documented the fence repair with photos and a dated invoice, thinking that would be the end of it. I underestimated how much power trips can distort reality when someone smells leverage. What I didn't realize then was that Ms. K had already decided this wasn't about a cat, but about control. The first formal complaint arrived 3 days later, slid into my mailbox with the soft thud of thick paper against metal, the sun already dipping low. It wasn't from the neighbor, it was from the board. The language was cold and procedural, citing nuisance behavior and animal control concerns. Attached was a copy of an association bylaw I'd never seen enforced before, vaguely worded and open to interpretation. I responded calmly, referencing the agricultural exception and attaching my documentation. I included a copy of the repair invoice and a short incident timeline. It felt excessive for such a minor issue, but experience had taught me that paper trails matter when dealing with a homeowners association drama scenario. The board's reply took a week. It acknowledged receipt but added a warning that further incidents could result in fines. No apology, no recognition of the exception. Just a subtle shift in tone, like a door quietly locking. The wind picked up that evening, rattling the barn siding, and I had a bad feeling that wouldn't leave. Then came the second notice, labeled as a preliminary violation with a fine attached. It referenced a board agenda excerpt from a closed meeting I hadn't been invited to, dated May 12th, where my property was discussed as a risk to community harmony. That phrase stuck with me, because harmony apparently didn't include farms existing next to lawns. I paid the fine under protest to avoid escalation and sent another response, this time by certified mail. I cited the CCR Section 4.3 mailbox rule they'd recently enforced on others, pointing out that proper notice procedures hadn't been followed. I thought logic might slow things down. Instead, it seemed to embolden them. The money wasn't the real issue yet, but the way the board ignored its own rules told me this HOA versus homeowner fight was only warming up. The third letter hinted at inspections, at potential suspension of my agricultural exception. That's when I realized Ms. K wasn't just angry, she was methodically pushing buttons, testing how far she could go before I snapped. I didn't give her that satisfaction. I logged dates, scanned envelopes, and added everything to a growing binder that would later matter more than I could have imagined. By the time the calendar rolled forward another week, the tension was thick enough to taste, the evenings quieter than usual, and I knew this was heading somewhere dark if I didn't stay ahead of it. By the time we crossed the 10-minute mark of this mess, the pattern was impossible to ignore. The board wasn't responding to facts, it was responding to pressure, and Ms. K was applying it relentlessly. Every few days, another envelope appeared, heavier than the last, the paper stiff and official, the late afternoon sun bleaching the ink through the slot. These weren't random. Each notice referenced the previous one, stacking like bricks in a wall meant to box me in. One cited an alleged failure to control animals. Another questioned whether my livestock exceeded permitted numbers, despite inspection photos on file showing compliance. The language grew sharper, more confident, as if they'd already decided how this story would end. I requested a hearing. The bylaws allowed it, and I followed the procedure exactly, down to the certified receipt and the 30-day window. The reply came back faster than anything else had. The board acknowledged my request but scheduled it for a weekday morning, a time they knew would disrupt my workday. The tone felt deliberate, the hum of insects loud as I read it under the barn's shade. That hearing date wasn't just inconvenient, it was the deadline Ms. K needed to push things further. In the days leading up to the hearing, the social pressure started. Neighbors I'd known for years suddenly avoided eye contact. One asked, indirectly, whether my farm was about to be shut down. Another mentioned a community email thread discussing safety concerns, though my name was conspicuously absent. That omission said everything. Ms. K had mastered the art of implication. She didn't accuse me outright, she framed me as a problem the community needed to solve. The board circulated a temporary compliance reminder, urging residents to report issues promptly. I recognized the tactic immediately. It was about isolating me, turning inconvenience into stigma. I attended the hearing anyway, prepared and calm. I brought copies of every notice, every receipt, and the original approval documents for my farm. The room was fluorescent lit and cold, the hum of the lights louder than any conversation. Ms. K sat at the end of the table, arms folded, eyes fixed on me like this was a trial she expected to win. I spoke plainly. I outlined the timeline, referenced the agricultural exception, and pointed out procedural violations, including the lack of proper notice before fines were issued. I didn't accuse anyone of bad faith. I didn't raise my voice. The board listened, nodded, and then deferred a decision pending further review. That should have been a pause. Instead, it became permission. The escalation came fast after that. A final notice arrived, dated June 3rd, threatening suspension of my exception unless corrective action was taken within 10 days. No specifics, just a vague demand for compliance and a warning about enforcement measures. The paper smelled faintly of toner, still warm, like it had been printed with urgency. This was the first time I felt real financial risk. Losing the exception would mean dismantling my operation or facing daily fines that would bleed me dry. I contacted my insurance provider to confirm coverage details, documenting the call time and summary, just in case. It felt paranoid then. It wouldn't later. I also installed additional cameras, focusing on the perimeter and barn area. Not hidden, not secretive, just standard surveillance for property protection. I logged their installation date and kept the receipts. If this was going to become an HOA revenge story, I intended to survive it by the book. Around the 20-minute mark, the stakes shifted from paperwork to something far more dangerous, and I didn't see it coming until it was too late. The tension peaked on a humid night, the air heavy and still. I'd finished evening rounds and turned in early. Sometime before dawn, I woke to a smell that didn't belong, sharp and acrid. By the time I reached the window, I could see an orange glow where darkness should have been. The fire tore through the barn with terrifying speed. I won't describe the worst of it, only that years of work were gone before the sun fully rose, smoke drifting low over the fields. Emergency crews arrived quickly, lights flashing against the haze, and the fire was contained before it spread further. Standing there afterward, boots damp from the grass, I realized this wasn't an accident. The fire marshal's preliminary assessment confirmed it later that morning. Suspicious origin, investigation pending. The quiet after the sirens faded was deafening. A minor pet incident had escalated into fines, threats, and social pressure, all documented meticulously. Now, with my barn destroyed under suspicious circumstances, the paper trail and surveillance I'd kept suddenly mattered more than ever. The board's response was swift but calculated. They issued a statement expressing concern and reminding residents to remain calm. Privately, they postponed any enforcement action against me, citing the ongoing investigation. Publicly, they said nothing about the fire's cause. Ms. K, however, couldn't help herself. She filed an emergency motion with the board to suspend my exception immediately, arguing that the fire proved my operation was unsafe. The timing was telling, the ink barely dry on the marshal's report before she moved. This was the moment I stopped reacting and started planning. I reviewed insurance timelines, noting when claims had to be filed and when inspections would occur. I cross-referenced them with HOA procedures, spotting conflicts that couldn't be ignored. The association had rules for emergency actions, and Ms. K was pushing them to break their own bylaws again. At 30 minutes in, I realized the board had a choice to make, and either way, someone was about to lose badly. I submitted a formal objection, attaching evidence from my cameras showing activity near the barn the night of the fire. I didn't name names. I didn't speculate. I simply noted that the footage existed and had been preserved. The effect was immediate. The board delayed the vote, citing legal counsel. Ms. K's urgency suddenly vanished, replaced by silence. The power she'd wielded so confidently was starting to wobble, and the association knew it. The stage was set for the final act, and all I had to do was let the timeline play out. Once the board postponed that vote, the entire dynamic shifted. The silence wasn't peace, it was fear. Emails that used to arrive with sharp subject lines stopped altogether, and the neighborhood felt unusually still. The only sound the low were of reconstruction equipment as investigators finished their work. I didn't push. I let deadlines loom. Insurance adjusters scheduled their inspections, and I made sure every visit was logged, every report copied. The fire marshal's findings were still pending, but the timeline alone mattered. Any enforcement action taken before that conclusion would expose the association to liability they couldn't shrug off. This was the legal consequence phase, where every impatient move Ms. K wanted to make could blow back on the board itself. Behind the scenes, I filed a records request under the association's own disclosure rules. Board emails, meeting minutes, emergency motions, everything related to my property. They had 10 days to comply. The request wasn't aggressive, it was procedural, and that made it terrifying. When the documents arrived, they confirmed what I suspected. Ms. K had emailed multiple board members late at night, urging immediate action and referencing the fire as leverage. One message included speculation about cause, framed as certainty. That single misstep tied her narrative to the incident in a way she couldn't undo. I forwarded the packet to my insurer and noted the timestamps. I also shared it with the board's counsel, again without accusation. Just facts. Just sequence. The association was now staring down a potential HOA nightmare of its own making. The social tide turned quickly after that. Neighbors who'd avoided me started asking questions. Rumors shifted direction, and the same implication tactics Ms. K used began circling back toward her, the evening breeze carrying whispered doubts across property lines. The climax came quietly, not with a confrontation, but with a notice. The board issued a formal resolution rescinding all fines related to the incident and reaffirming my agricultural exception. Buried in the language was a clause distancing the association from any individual actions taken without authorization. That was the tell. They were cutting her loose. Days later, the fire marshal's report was finalized. It confirmed intentional ignition and ruled out any operational cause tied to my farm. Surveillance footage I'd preserved filled in the gaps, showing a familiar silhouette near the barn that night. I turned everything over to the proper authorities and stepped back. There was no dramatic arrest scene, no public spectacle. Ms. K resigned from the board citing personal reasons. The association issued a community letter emphasizing unity and policy review. The same system she'd abused had isolated her when the risk became real. This wasn't about watching someone fall. It was about watching accountability finally land where it belonged. The satisfaction came from knowing I'd stayed inside the lines while exposing how fragile power trips really are. In the world of Karen neighbor drama, patience is the sharpest tool you have. Rebuilding took months. The barn went up stronger, better documented, fully compliant down to the last bolt. Insurance covered the losses, and the association stayed conspicuously out of my way. The cost wasn't just financial. Trust doesn't recover as easily as structures do. Still, there was closure. The farm survived. The rules were clarified. And the board learned that procedure cuts both ways. This wasn't just my fight. It became a cautionary tale whispered whenever someone suggested flexing authority for personal grudges. In the end, it was a satisfying revenge story without a single shouted word. If this HOA versus homeowners saga hit close to home, like, share, subscribe, turn on notifications, drop your HOA experience in the comments, and thanks for watching as we unpack how power trips can backfire hard. Next time, I'll tell you about the neighbor who tried to enforce rules that didn't exist, only to discover the fine print worked against him. Different board, same petty energy, and a lesson that still echoes through the cul-de-sac.